What happens when cruelty crosses paths with brilliance? When prejudice is met with quiet resilience? In an upscale New York restaurant, two lives intertwine in an unexpected moment of humiliation. Ethan Caldwell, once a rising star in classical music, now spends his nights serving at the Langston, one of Manhattan's most exclusive dining establishments. Trained at the prestigious Berklee College of Music, his voice, a gift nurtured since childhood, has been silenced by circumstance, hidden behind a waiter's uniform and the polished etiquette of fine dining. On the other side of the equation is Isabelle Harrington, a powerful real estate executive whose life has been shaped by both privilege and expectation. The daughter of a celebrated pianist, she has spent years running from her mother's shadow. Hardened by ambition, she wields her influence with the certainty of someone who has never been told no. On her birthday, with champagne flowing and an audience eager for amusement, Isabelle makes a careless demand: Ethan should sing for her entertainment. But what begins as a moment of condescension unravels into something far more profound. A single song, Amazing Grace, cuts through the carefully curated walls they've both built around themselves. In that moment, past wounds are exposed, truths long buried rise to the surface, and an unexpected transformation begins. This is a story about the power of music to heal, the weight of dreams left unfulfilled, and the way redemption often finds us in the most unexpected places. Through their journey, we witness how prejudice can silence even the most extraordinary voices, how privilege can blind us to our own humanity, and how second chances sometimes arrive disguised as crises. As Ethan and Isabelle navigate the fallout of their fateful encounter, they come to learn a difficult truth. Sometimes, our greatest disappointments are simply the path leading us toward our true purpose. The brass handles of the Langston's heavy oak doors gleamed in the golden afternoon light, a daily reminder to Ethan Caldwell that he was stepping into a world that was never truly his own. With practiced precision, he adjusted his neatly knotted black tie and smoothed out the crisp white fabric of his uniform. The ritual was second nature by now, as familiar as the deep breath he took before crossing the threshold. After 7 years at the restaurant, he had learned how to navigate the space effortlessly. An environment where elegance was expected and perfection was the bare minimum. The moment he stepped through the staff entrance, the contrast hit him as it always did. The kitchen was alive with a chaotic energy, the rhythmic clang of pots, the sizzle of meat hitting a hot pan, the sharp commands of Chef Laurent, who ruled this domain with a mix of brilliance and barely contained exasperation. Caldwell? The chef's booming voice cut through the noise, his thick French accent wrapping around Ethan's last name like an old habit. The man's round face broke into a grin. Always early, eh? Good. The mayor's office just booked a last-minute table. You'll take care of them, yes? Ethan nodded. Of course, chef. He moved toward the lockers, placing his worn messenger bag inside. Tucked neatly within it was a weathered music book, filled with handwritten notes and fading ink. A relic from a past life, one he hadn't entirely let go of. Even now, he found himself flipping through its pages during his lunch breaks, his fingers tracing the compositions as if they might still lead him somewhere. At 36, Ethan carried himself with an effortless grace, his movements deliberate, refined, a trait cultivated both in the world of fine dining and in the years he had spent on stage, training his voice to perfection. His dark eyes held a quiet warmth, though few took the time to notice. Across the room, Miriam, a veteran server whose silver-streaked hair was pulled into a no-nonsense bun, gave him a knowing look. "Did you see the new girl?" she asked, stacking plates with the efficiency of someone who had spent 2 decades in this industry. "Poor thing, looks ready to faint." Ethan followed her gaze to where the young trainee, Sophie, barely out of college, was fumbling with a wine opener, her hands trembling slightly. He offered a small, reassuring smile. "We were all new once," he said. "I'll keep an eye on her if she's in my section." The dining room was a masterpiece of old-world charm. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over immaculate table settings, dark mahogany paneling adorned with original artwork. Everything had to be perfect. Perfection was Ethan's armor. As he moved through the room, completing his pre-service checks, his mind drifted to the early morning vocal exercises he still practiced in the solitude of his apartment, to the echoes of his grandmother's voice. Baby, when God gives you a gift, you don't let it gather dust. You keep it polished, even if nobody else sees it shine. By 6 o'clock, the first guests arrived, and Ethan slipped into the rhythm of service. His voice, always measured and composed, shifted to its professional cadence, polite, attentive, but never servile. At table 24, he recommended the chef's special, a pan-seared sea bass with a delicate herb crust, to an older couple. The wife smiled at him, appreciative. Her husband, on the other hand, barely glanced up. Ethan was used to this dual existence, visible yet invisible. In this world, he was both indispensable and entirely overlooked. He had learned to read people quickly, to adjust his approach accordingly. Near the service station, he caught snippets of conversation from his colleagues. Miriam was talking about her son's college applications. Nathan, the youngest server on staff, was excitedly chatting about his band's upcoming gig at a downtown bar. "You should come hear us play, Ethan," Nathan said, grinning. "Didn't you say you were into music?" Ethan offered the same response he always did, a polite but firm refusal. The truth? The part he never spoke out loud was that music had once been his world. He had been a teacher, a performer, a voice that had been destined for something greater. Until life had taken a different turn. The night moved on, the restaurant humming with conversation, and the soft notes of live piano music drifting from the corner stage. Then, from across the room, a disturbance broke through the seamless flow of service. At table 17, the young trainee Sophie stood frozen, her face flushed with humiliation as a customer berated her over a wine selection. The man's voice carried across the dining room, sharp and cutting. Without hesitation, Ethan stepped in. "Pardon me, sir," he said smoothly, his tone calm but firm. "I'd be happy to assist with selecting another wine more to your preference." His presence alone seemed to shift the balance. The customer's anger wavered, then faded. Within moments, the situation was resolved. Later, in the quiet of the kitchen, Sophie approached him, eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for earlier. I almost quit on the spot." Ethan paused, placing the finishing touches on a plated dish. Then, in a low voice, he said, "The hardest part of this job isn't carrying plates or memorizing wine lists. It's remembering who you are, no matter how others choose to see you." As the evening wound down, Ethan found himself at the service bar, absent-mindedly polishing glasses. A familiar melody drifted in from the restaurant speakers, an old jazz standard, one his grandmother used to hum. Almost without thinking, he hummed along, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know you could sing," Sophie remarked, stacking menus nearby. Ethan fell silent, his fingers stilling against the glass. "Just an old habit," he said. But deep down, he knew some habits never truly fade, and some voices refuse to be silenced forever. Between courses, Ethan caught pieces of conversation drifting from the service station. Miriam was discussing her son's college applications, her voice tinged with a mother's quiet pride. Across from her, Nathan, the youngest server besides the trainee, spoke animatedly about his band's upcoming show at a downtown bar. "You should come hear us play, Ethan," Nathan said, his enthusiasm infectious. "Didn't you mention you were into music?" Ethan gave his usual polite smile and shook his head. "Maybe another time," he replied, the same answer he always gave. The truth? He had once taught music theory at a prestigious prep school. He had trained in classical voice at Berkeley. But life had taken unexpected turns, and those parts of him now remained locked away where they were safest. The evening moved smoothly until a sudden commotion at table 22 shattered the restaurant's refined hum. A customer's raised voice carried across the dining room, laced with irritation. Ethan turned in time to see Sophie, the new trainee, standing frozen, her hands trembling as she fumbled with a wine selection. Without hesitation, he stepped in. "Pardon me, sir," Ethan said smoothly, his voice steady and controlled. "I'd be happy to assist in selecting something more to your taste." The man's anger wavered, then deflated under Ethan's calm presence. Within moments, the situation was resolved. Later, in the kitchen, Sophie found him as he was garnishing a plate of Dover sole. "Thank you for earlier," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I almost walked out right then and there." Ethan set down his plating tweezers and looked at her. "The hardest part of this job isn't carrying trays or memorizing wine lists," he said. "It's remembering who you are. No matter how others see you, don't let anyone take that from you." As the night wound down, Ethan found himself behind the service bar, absently polishing a wine glass. From the restaurant's speakers, a familiar melody drifted into the air, an old jazz standard his grandmother used to hum while making breakfast. Almost unconsciously, he hummed along. "I didn't know you could sing," Sophie remarked, stacking dessert menus nearby. Ethan's hand stilled on the glass. "Just an old habit," he said after a beat. But even as he dismissed it, his fingers tapped the counter in rhythm, muscle memory refusing to fade. The final guests departed just after 11, leaving behind the comfortable quiet of closing time. Ethan completed his final tasks, refilling salt shakers, folding linen napkins for the next day. He allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. Another shift completed. Another night of carefully measured words and controlled movements. Chef Laurent emerged from the kitchen, still wearing his white coat, now stained from a long night's work. "Good night, everyone," he called out, clapping Ethan on the shoulder as he passed. Caldwell, excellence, as always. Outside, the city lights glowed against the night sky, the stars barely visible through New York's haze. Ethan walked to his car in the employee lot, exhaling deeply as he leaned against the door for a moment. His grandmother used to say that music was like the stars. Even when you couldn't see them, they were still there, shining. He reached for his bag, fingers brushing the familiar edges of his worn music book. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to remember before sliding into the driver's seat. Tomorrow would bring another day of balance, another night of careful restraint, but here, alone in the silence of his car, Ethan finally allowed himself to sing. His voice filled the space, rich and deep, carrying the weight of memory, of dreams deferred, but not yet forgotten, a talent that refused to dim. Elsewhere in the city, Isabelle Harrington's designer heels clicked sharply against the marble floor of her corner office, the rhythm matching her rapid-fire instructions into her earpiece. At 29, she was already a partner at Harrington & Co., one of Manhattan's most powerful real estate firms, a fact she made sure was well known. "No, absolutely not," she said curtly, pacing before the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. "Tell them we need those permits by Friday, or we take our business elsewhere." She ran manicured fingers through her perfectly styled blonde hair, barely listening to the excuses on the other end of the line. "I don't care if it's impossible. Make it happen." Ending the call, Isabelle sank into her ergonomic chair, swiveling to face the skyline. The morning sun turned the river to liquid gold, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already racing to the next task. Meetings, site visits, dinner plans at the Langston with her usual crowd. Her assistant, Kara, appeared in the doorway, placing a steaming cup of oat milk latte, extra hot, on the glass desk. "Your 9 o'clock is here," Kara said. "And your father called. Again." Isabelle's eyebrows twitched slightly. "Tell him I'm in meetings all day," she said, not looking up. "And reschedule the 9. I need to review the Westbrook development contracts first." Kara hesitated, but said nothing, disappearing as swiftly as she had entered. Isabelle allowed herself a moment of stillness. The office walls were adorned with accolades. Youngest partner in firm history. Forbes 30 under 30. Top real estate power player. Every award was carefully placed, each one telling a story she wanted the world to see. Her phone buzzed. A message from Cassandra, her closest friend, or at least the person who most closely resembled a friend in her highly curated social circle. "Don't forget dinner tonight at the Langston. Trevor's bringing his new investment banker friend. Wear the black Chanel." Isabelle typed a quick reply, already considering the right accessories for the outfit. These dinners had become routine, a delicate dance of fine wine, subtle power plays, and perfectly timed laughter. She excelled at the game, at everything. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between meetings and networking events, a different sensation crept in, a hollowness she couldn't quite name. She dismissed the thought. Lunch was spent picking at a salad while skimming property portfolios on her tablet. The office hummed around her, but she remained locked in her own world of spreadsheets and negotiations. Her phone buzzed again, another missed call from her father. She dismissed it without hesitation. "Miss Harrington?" Kara interrupted her thoughts. "The contractors for the Lexington Tower project need your signature on these forms." Isabelle barely glanced up. "Leave them. I'll review before I leave." She paused. And have the car service ready at 7. I'm dining at the Langston tonight. By the time she left the office, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the city streets. Settling into the back of her town car, she touched up her makeup with practiced efficiency. Everything in her life was measured, controlled, calculated, and tonight would be no different. She had no idea that before the night was over, a single voice would shatter that illusion completely. Back in her office, Isabelle Harrington sat in stillness for a rare moment, her gaze flicking over the perfectly arranged plaques on the wall. Youngest partner in firm history. Forbes 30 under 30. Real estate power player. Each accolade was a carefully curated piece of the image she had built, one of ambition, dominance, and undeniable success. Her phone vibrated on the desk. A text from Cassandra, her closest friend, or rather the person who best fit the role in her carefully managed social circle. Don't forget dinner tonight at the Langston. Trevor's bringing his new yacht broker friend. Total catch. Wear the black Chanel. Isabelle responded with a quick confirmation, already mentally selecting accessories to match the suggested dress. These dinners had become a weekly ritual, an endless loop of expensive wine, strategic networking, and flawless execution of social power plays. She excelled at them. She excelled at everything. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings, negotiations, and phone calls. Isabelle moved through her day with practiced precision, her confidence as much a part of her ensemble as her designer heels. Yet in rare moments between deals and carefully controlled conversations, a different sensation crept in. A hollow space she refused to acknowledge. At lunch, she absently picked at a kale and quinoa salad while reviewing investment portfolios on her tablet. Around her, the office hummed with energy, but she remained in her own world of numbers and projections. A notification popped up. Missed call. Dad, without hesitation, she dismissed it. Miss Harrington? Her assistant, Kara, had appeared in the doorway. The contractors for the Lexington Tower project need your signature on these forms. Isabelle glanced up, her expression shifting effortlessly into professional mode. Leave them here. I'll review them before I leave. She paused, then added, and have the car service ready at 7. I'm dining at the Langston tonight. By the time she stepped out of the office, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the streets of Manhattan. Settling into the black town car, she touched up her lipstick in the mirror, ensuring every detail remained flawless. The black Chanel dress hugged her figure perfectly, a power color for a power player. The Langston stood like a beacon of old-world luxury amidst the modern skyline. Isabelle had been dining here for years, long enough to be recognized by name. As soon as she stepped through the grand doors, the maître greeted her with well-practiced deference. Good evening, Miss Harrington. Your usual table is ready. Your guests have already arrived. She swept into the dining room, aware of heads turning as she passed. The restaurant wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. The soft lighting, the gentle hum of cultured conversation, the quiet clink of crystal and fine china. At her usual table, Cassandra waved her over, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Darling, you look amazing. Come meet James. He just got back from Monaco. The next hour melted into a carefully choreographed dance of subtle flirtation and veiled business talk. Isabelle played her part flawlessly, laughing at the right moments, revealing just enough about her latest development projects to maintain intrigue without seeming boastful. Yet something felt off tonight. Maybe it was the third missed call from her father, lingering in the back of her mind. Or maybe it was the yacht broker's stories, pulling at half-buried memories of summers on her family's boat. Before everything changed, before her mother, a voice interrupted her thoughts. More wine, ma'am? She looked up, meeting dark eyes that quickly averted in trained deference. Something about the waiter's presence, the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, made her pause. Then she dismissed it. Yes, she said, perhaps more curtly than intended, and make sure it's properly chilled this time. His tone remained perfectly neutral. Of course, madam. As he turned away, Cassandra leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. God, can you believe they let him serve in the main dining room? I know we're all supposed to be progressive now, but really. Isabelle felt something twist in her stomach, an old, familiar discomfort, but she shoved it aside, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Tell me more about that South End property, she said, redirecting the conversation to safer ground. The waiter returned with the wine. His movements were smooth, precise, practiced. As he poured, Isabelle caught a glimpse of herself in the dark reflection of the glass. Perfectly poised, perfectly polished, perfectly empty. As the evening wound down and the bills were settled with a collection of platinum cards, Isabelle found herself lingering at the table. Her companions had already departed, swept away in their luxury town cars toward after-parties and late-night lounges. She remained, staring at the last sip of wine in her glass, lost in thought. Why did she feel so unsettled? The hum of conversation around her faded into the background. The refined atmosphere, the expensive wine, the flawless execution of social performance, none of it filled the space inside her tonight. Her phone buzzed. Another missed call from her father. For the first time in years, she almost answered. Almost. Instead, she picked up her clutch and rose from the table. As she moved toward the exit, her gaze flickered to the waiter clearing her table. For a brief moment, she watched him. The grace in his movements, the quiet air of someone who carried far more than just trays. Something about him lingered in her mind. But then, the valet pulled up with her car, and she stepped inside without another glance. As the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, Isabelle reached for her phone, not to call her father back, but to check her schedule for the next morning. Another day. Another deal. Another distraction. Yet as she stared at the screen, she caught herself humming. A melody she hadn't thought about in years, a song she didn't even realize she remembered. The restaurant had settled into a quiet hum, with only a handful of tables still occupied. The soft strains of jazz floated through the air, blending seamlessly with the gentle clinking of silverware and the hushed conversations of the remaining diners. Seated alone, Isabelle Harrington swirled the last sip of Bordeaux in her glass, staring at the deep red liquid as if it held answers. That song, something about it tugged at a memory she couldn't quite reach. It reminded her of Sunday mornings long ago, of sun-drenched piano keys and laughter, of her mother's fingers gliding effortlessly over the ivory, filling their home with music. A voice interrupted her reverie. "Will there be anything else, madam?" She blinked, pulled back to the present. The waiter stood before her, patient and poised. Her mask slipped back into place instantly. "No," she said, her voice cool, distant. She gathered her clutch. Just the check. As she stepped into the crisp night air, that familiar hollow feeling crept in again. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Her father, again. For a fleeting second, she considered answering. Almost. Instead, she typed a short message to her driver, waiting outside. The city lights shimmered on the restaurant's windows. Through the glass, she could see the waiter clearing her table, his movements too graceful for such a mundane task. The car arrived, and Isabelle slipped into the cool leather interior, her black Chanel dress a sharp contrast against the dim glow of the dashboard lights. As the car pulled away from the Langston, she caught herself humming the jazz tune from earlier. Her mother had loved jazz, had filled their house with it. Before Isabelle stopped listening, she cut off the thought abruptly. "Home," she instructed the driver, her tone sharp enough to discourage conversation. She spent the ride burying herself in emails, focusing on numbers, acquisitions, and negotiations instead of memories and missed calls. In her penthouse apartment, she kicked off her Louboutins and poured herself a whiskey. Neat. The city stretched out before her, a glittering sea of lights, a skyline of ambition and power. She had everything she had worked for. Success, influence, control. So why did the silence feel so loud tonight? Her phone buzzed one last time. "Dad." A text followed. "Just wanted to remind you. It's 10 years tomorrow. I thought maybe we could visit her together." Isabelle stared at the screen. After a long moment, she set the phone face down on the counter. Tomorrow was another day of meetings and deals, of calculated moves and carefully maintained facades. She would not think about jazz music or Sunday mornings or the way her mother's piano had sat untouched for months before it was finally sold. But later, as she prepared for bed, that melody slipped from her lips again, haunting her like a ghost of something lost, something she didn't even know she was missing. The Langston buzzed with an unusual energy on a Wednesday night in late September. Isabelle Harrington's birthday celebration, had taken over the restaurant's premier section. 3 tables combined to accommodate her carefully selected guests. Crystal glasses caught the glow of the chandeliers, casting prisms across expensive silk dresses and tailored suits. Moving through the space with practiced ease, Ethan Caldwell maintained his usual composure, though tonight's service required extra attention. 4 bottles of Dom Perignon in, and the night was just beginning. "Another round for the birthday girl." Cassandra's voice rang out across the room, drawing annoyed glances from nearby tables. "And make it snappy." Ethan approached the table with steady professionalism. At its center, Isabelle, resplendent in a gold sequined dress, sat with her champagne flute raised. Her cheeks were flushed, her normally controlled demeanor showing hairline cracks beneath the alcohol and the evening's indulgence. "Certainly, madam," Ethan replied, turning toward the bar to retrieve the champagne. As he walked away, he caught snippets of conversation. "God, Isabelle, remember last year at Lure?" One of the men slurred. Laughter rippled through the group. "That waitress who said she was an actress? You made her recite Shakespeare." Isabelle's laugh rang out, high and crystalline, like shattered glass. "She claimed to be an actress," she said, amused. "I was just giving her a chance to prove it." Ethan returned, movements measured, deliberate as he poured. Years in this industry had taught him to recognize the look in Isabelle's eyes, that dangerous glint of someone who had had too much to drink and was searching for amusement. "You know what would make this birthday perfect?" Isabelle's voice sliced through the hum of conversation. Ethan didn't react, continuing to pour smoothly. "Almost done. Just a few more seconds." Then a hand closed around his wrist. He froze. The room shifted, conversations stilled, subtle glances flickering toward them. Isabelle's manicured nails pressed lightly into his skin. "You must know some songs," she said, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. "Something spiritual, perhaps?" The table fell silent, the kind of silence that precedes storms. Across the room, Ethan saw Sophie at the service station, tense, eyes wide. In the kitchen doorway, Chef Laurent stood motionless, his expression darkening. Ethan inhaled slowly. "I'm afraid I'm just a waiter, madam," he said, voice even, controlled. "Perhaps I could have the pianist play something for your celebration instead." But Isabelle's grip tightened. "Oh, come now." She tilted her head, smiling. "Don't be modest. I bet you have a wonderful singing voice." Her next words, said with the casual cruelty of privilege, sent a ripple through the air. "All your people do, don't they?" A quiet gasp from a nearby table. The room shifted again, tension thick as unspoken words. Ethan felt every pair of eyes on him, waiting. He thought of his rent due next week, the medical bills still piling up from his grandmother's final months, the countless times he had chosen silence over dignity because survival demanded it. And then, he thought of his grandmother's voice. "Baby, some things are worth more than money. Your soul is one of them." Before he could answer, Isabelle let go and rose to her feet, swaying slightly. She raised her glass to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice rang out, laced with champagne and entitlement. "Our waiter here is going to favor us with a song. Let's all make him feel welcome." A few nervous laughs from her table. But the rest of the restaurant? Silent. Ethan saw Sophie step forward, as if ready to intervene. Saw Chef Laurent start moving toward them. But with one small motion, he stopped them both. He had already made his choice. His hands relaxed at his sides. He straightened his posture. His voice was calm. "Very well, Miss Harrington," he said. "If you insist." Ethan held his ground, his expression unreadable, his voice steady. "Perhaps I could have the pianist play something for your celebration instead, Miss Harrington." But Isabelle's grip on his wrist tightened. "Oh, come now, don't be modest," she coaxed, her lips curling into an amused smirk. "I bet you have a wonderful singing voice. All your people do, don't they?" A hush fell over the dining room. A woman at a nearby table gasped softly. Across the room, Chef Laurent stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, his jaw clenched. Ethan's stomach coiled, but he didn't let it show. "Miss Harrington," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to serve your meal, not to provide entertainment." Isabelle pouted dramatically, turning toward her audience with feigned disappointment. "But it's my birthday," she drawled, her voice laced with tipsy playfulness, "and I'm one of this restaurant's best customers. Surely you want to make the customer happy?" Beneath the surface of her words lay a thinly veiled threat. Ethan thought of his rent, due in a few days, the medical bills still stacking up from his grandmother's final months, the sacrifices he had made just to keep his life afloat. He had swallowed his pride before, countless times, because survival had always mattered more. But then, he thought of his grandmother's words. Baby, some things are worth more than money, your soul is one of them. Before he could speak, Isabelle released his wrist and stood up, swaying slightly. She raised her champagne glass, her voice loud enough to capture the attention of the entire restaurant. Ladies and gentlemen, every conversation in the room halted. The other guests turned toward her, their curiosity piqued. Oblivious to the tension in the air, Isabelle's lips curled into a triumphant smile. Our waiter here is going to favor us with a song. Let's all make him feel welcome. A few of her guests laughed uneasily, but the rest of the restaurant remained deathly silent. Ethan saw Sophie tense near the service station, her hands clenched around a tray. He heard Chef Laurent's heavy footsteps approaching from the kitchen. But he lifted a hand slightly, stopping them both. In that moment, time seemed to slow. His mind drifted back to all the years behind him. The scholarships lost to budget cuts, the teaching position at a prestigious academy that had been suddenly withdrawn, the opera company that had promised him a role before finding someone who better fit their vision. The hundreds of closed doors, the unspoken barriers. Then he looked at Isabelle Harrington's face. She was still smirking, still drunk on her own privilege. But beneath the amusement, beneath the champagne haze, he saw something else. Something that looked almost like desperation. Ethan took a slow breath, straightened his spine, adjusted his tie, and then he said, his voice steady, deliberate. Very well, Miss Harrington, if you insist. The restaurant held its collective breath. For the first time that evening, Isabelle's smile wavered. She hadn't expected him to accept. She lowered herself back into her chair, fingers curling around her wine glass like it was a lifeline. Ethan closed his eyes. For just a moment, he wasn't in the Langston. He was in his grandmother's church, standing beside her at the old upright piano as she taught him to let his voice soar above earthly concerns. He took a deep breath and sang. The first note of Amazing Grace filled the room, and time stood still. Ethan's voice, rich as aged bourbon, smooth as velvet, powerful as a rising tide, transformed the air itself. The very first words silenced every conversation, stilled every fork, froze every breath. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The melody rose and fell, wrapping itself around every person in the restaurant, sinking into the spaces between them, into the cracks they didn't even know existed. In his mind, Ethan saw his grandmother again, stirring a pot of grits in their tiny kitchen, humming the song as the scent of cornbread baking in the oven filled the air. That saved a wretch like me. At table 7, an elderly couple stopped eating entirely, their meal forgotten. A businessman, who had been in the middle of a heated phone call moments ago, now held his phone limply in his hand, his mouth slightly open. And Isabelle. She had gone completely still. Her wine glass, raised halfway to her lips, trembled slightly in her grip. She wasn't smirking anymore. She looked stunned. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Ethan kept his eyes focused on a point just above the guests' heads, refusing to look directly at anyone. But he could feel them. The entire restaurant had become an audience. And this was no ordinary performance. This was something deeper, something raw, something undeniable. Was blind, but now I see. His voice soared higher, filling every corner of the restaurant, every empty space in between. Years of technical mastery, of discipline, of raw, untapped potential surged through every note. At the kitchen doorway, Chef Laurent, who had never shown a hint of sentimentality, now stood with tears glistening in his eyes. At the service station, Sophie clutched a napkin to her chest, her expression a mixture of pride and fierce joy. And Isabelle. Her face was drained of color. Her perfectly composed mask had shattered. Through many dangers, toils, and snares. Ethan thought of his own struggles, the scholarship committee's apologies, the regretful rejections from casting directors, the way his grandmother had squeezed his hand in her hospital bed, whispering, "Don't ever let them take your song from you, baby. I have already come." His voice, unshaken, carried years of pain, of resilience, of hope. At Isabelle's table, she was no longer pretending to be entertained. Her hand rested on the tablecloth, knuckles white, her expression unreadable. But her eyes, Her eyes were filled with something Ethan had never expected. Recognition, or maybe remembrance. "'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far." The song reached its final verse, and as Ethan approached the last few notes, he finally allowed himself to look directly at Isabelle. Their eyes met, and in that instant, something shifted. Something broke. A tear, silent, unbidden, and entirely unnoticed by herself, slipped down Isabelle's cheek. "And grace will lead me home." The final note hung in the air like a prayer left unanswered. For a moment, a long, breathtaking moment, no one moved. Then, from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, a single pair of hands clapped, and then another, and another. And then, all at once, thunderous applause. Guests rose to their feet, the sound shaking the very walls. And still, Isabelle sat, motionless, the echoes of the song still reverberating through her mind. She had set out to humiliate him. Instead, she had been undone. And something told Ethan, this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. Ethan's voice soared through the final verse, his baritone rich and unwavering. "Grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." The last note hung in the air like crystal, pure and unshaken. For a long moment, no one moved. Not a single fork scraped against a plate. Not a whisper disturbed the silence. Then, from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, one pair of hands clapped, then another, and another, until the applause swelled into a standing ovation, shaking the very glasses on the tables. Diners rose to their feet, their appreciation drowning out any sense of propriety. At a corner table, an elderly woman openly wept, dabbing at her eyes with a linen napkin. Even the restaurant's owner, who had emerged from his office at the commotion, stood in stunned silence, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. But Ethan barely heard the applause. His gaze remained fixed on Isabelle Harrington. She hadn't moved, she hadn't clapped. She sat frozen, her expression completely undone. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, though she seemed unaware of them. Ethan had expected anger, embarrassment, anything but this. What he saw in her eyes instead was something far deeper. Not guilt, not humiliation, sadness. Then, barely above a whisper, Isabelle spoke, so softly that only Ethan could hear. "My mother," she said, her voice trembling. "She used to sing that in church." Ethan's chest tightened. Before he could respond, Isabelle abruptly stood. Her chair scraped against the floor, loud against the hushed room. Without a word to her guests, she grabbed her purse, turned, and fled. The doors swung shut behind her. A stunned silence followed in her wake. The applause gradually faded into murmurs. Ethan could hear snippets of conversation. That was incredible. He must be professionally trained. Why is he working here? A hand clapped his shoulder. Chef Laurent. The man, normally so composed, looked shaken. "Mon ami," he said quietly, "you have been hiding more than just your voice, I think." Ethan swallowed, his hands still trembling slightly. He straightened his tie, his professional mask sliding back into place. "If you'll excuse me, chef," he said softly, "I have other tables to attend to." But as he moved through the restaurant, continuing his duties as if nothing had happened, he knew everything had changed. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his past, around his talent, had cracked open with just one song. Later, in the quiet of the kitchen, he paused. Bracing himself against the prep counter, he closed his eyes. His grandmother's words echoed back to him. "Sometimes, baby, God makes us sing not for ourselves, but for someone else who needs to hear the music." Outside, in the dining room, Isabelle's abandoned guests whispered among themselves, confused by her sudden departure. Something told Ethan. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. A memory unlocked. Isabelle's Mercedes idled at a red light, but she barely noticed. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Tears still streaked her face. Her own mind betrayed her, playing back every note of Ethan's voice, every word of the song. Amazing Grace. Each note unlocked a door she had kept sealed for 10 years, a door that led straight to her mother. She saw Elizabeth Harrington, sitting at the baby grand piano, fingers dancing over the keys. Sunday mornings, the smell of fresh coffee and warm scones. Her mother's voice, soft but full of conviction. Music speaks what cannot be expressed. The light turned green. She didn't move. A sharp honk from behind jolted her back into the present. Her pulse hammering. She pulled into an empty parking lot, her entire body shaking. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Her breath came in uneven gasps. That voice. the waiter's voice. Somehow it had reached through 10 years of carefully built walls and shattered them in an instant. Damn him. The words left her lips in a whisper, but there was no real anger behind them. Instead, there was something far worse. She felt exposed, stripped bare in a way that terrified her. The cruel game she had played tonight had backfired spectacularly. It hadn't revealed his shame. It had revealed her own. Her phone buzzed beside her. A new message. She didn't have to check the screen. She already knew who it was. Her father. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow was the anniversary. 10 years. 10 years since her mother's voice had gone silent. 10 years since she had locked the door to the music that once filled their home. She exhaled shakily, staring at the glowing screen. Her father's text was short. I thought maybe we could visit her together. Isabelle's finger hovered over the reply button. But after a moment, she set the phone aside. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, she wiped her face, squared her shoulders, and pulled back onto the road. Tomorrow she would go back to being Isabelle Harrington, real estate mogul, power player, untouchable. Tomorrow she would pretend tonight never happened. And yet, as she drove through the quiet streets of Manhattan, she realized something strange. She was humming. That same haunting melody, the one she had sworn she'd forgotten. Isabelle's phone buzzed insistently on the passenger seat. Probably Cassandra, or one of her other guests. No doubt wondering why she had vanished from her own birthday celebration. She ignored it. Instead, she pulled up an old file buried deep in her photo archives. A picture she hadn't looked at in years. Her mother, seated at the piano, mid-laugh, her hands frozen above the keys, caught in motion. Their last Christmas together. A sharp ache twisted in her chest, a feeling she had spent a decade avoiding. She locked her phone and tossed it aside. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell sat at his small, upright piano, his fingers hovering over the keys. For the first time in months, he played. The instrument was out of tune, but he barely noticed. His hands instinctively found the melody he had sung earlier that night. Amazing Grace. His grandmother's voice filled his mind. Music ain't just about the notes, baby. It's about the spirit behind them. He had been 12 when she first noticed his gift, when she heard him singing along to the radio with perfect pitch. She had worked extra shifts as a nurse just to afford his first voice lessons. She had believed in him when no one else did. His phone lit up beside him. A message from Sophie. You okay? That was something else tonight. He hesitated, then typed back a short reply. I'm fine. And yet, was he? For years he had kept his talent hidden, protecting himself from the pain of doors slammed shut. Tonight, he had let that wall down, and now he wasn't sure how to feel about it. The next morning, Isabelle arrived at her office earlier than usual. Her makeup was flawless, expertly concealing the signs of a sleepless night. She had barely sat down when Kara appeared in the doorway, carrying a worn leather folder. There was hesitation in her assistant's voice. Someone dropped this off for you. Isabelle took it, frowning as she flipped it open. Inside was a yellowed program from Carnegie Hall, dated 15 years ago. A name leaped out at her. Ethan Caldwell. Her hands tightened around the folder. There in black ink was his name, listed among the featured performers. A rising star in the world of classical voice. Her breath caught as she read his biography. Berkeley Scholarship recipient, competition winner, glowing reviews from critics, and then nothing. Like he had simply vanished from the music world. Heart pounding, Isabelle turned to her laptop, her fingers moving instinctively. She searched his name. Article after article praised his early career, heralded him as the next great classical tenor. And then, they stopped, abruptly, except for one small piece buried in an old local paper. Promising career cut short. Racial controversy at the Metropolitan Opera. The details were vague, but reading between the lines, Isabelle felt sick. The same barriers that had derailed his career. They were the same ones her mother had fought against. The same prejudices that had driven Elizabeth Harrington to teach in inner-city schools instead of performing on the world's greatest stages. Her mother had refused to play their game, and it had cost her everything. Across town, Ethan arrived at the Langston, expecting nothing more than another shift. Instead, Chef Laurent was waiting for him. His expression gave nothing away. The owner wants to see you. Ethan's heart pounded. He had known there might be consequences for last night. He had prepared himself for the worst. But when he entered the office, he found Mr. Davidson, the owner, grinning at him. "My wife was here last night," the older man said. "She hasn't stopped talking about your voice." Ethan stayed silent. "Why didn't you tell us you were trained at Berkeley?" Ethan swallowed. "It didn't seem relevant to serving tables, sir." Davidson shook his head. "Well, it's relevant now." He leaned forward, excitement in his voice. "How would you feel about performing regularly? We could feature you on our jazz nights, make it a special attraction." Ethan felt the old familiar tightness in his chest. He had heard these words before. This could be an opportunity. But he had also learned, the hard way, how quickly opportunities could vanish when people's true colors came through. He took a slow breath. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I'm comfortable in my current position." Davidson looked surprised. "Just think about it, son." Ethan nodded, but in his heart he already knew the answer. As he left the office, he found Sophie waiting for him. "There's something else," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "That woman from last night, Miss Harrington." Ethan stiffened. "She's been calling all morning, asking when your shift starts." Ethan exhaled slowly. And sure enough, when the lunch hour rolled around, she was there. Table 12. Her usual confidence was absent. She had changed her usual evening reservation to lunch, ensuring that they would be able to talk. On the table beside her sat the Carnegie Hall program. Unopened, her water glass sat untouched. When Ethan emerged from the kitchen and saw her, he paused for half a second before approaching. His professional mask was firmly in place, but in his eyes there was something else. A quiet wariness, a knowing. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Would you like to see the lunch menu?" he asked, tone polite but distant. She took a deep breath. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. He hesitated. She added almost pleadingly, "Please." After a long moment, Ethan pulled out the chair and sat down. His posture was straight, guarded. Isabelle exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Then, finally, she met his eyes. "What I did last night was cruel and inexcusable," she said. "I wanted to apologize, not just for my behavior, but for everything it represented." She swallowed, her hands tightening around her napkin. She hesitated. "I'm deeply ashamed." Ethan's face remained carefully neutral, but something in his eyes softened, just slightly. She had expected him to be furious. Instead, he simply waited, letting her speak, letting her own it. And for the first time in her life, Isabelle wanted to be worthy of that patience. She wasn't sure if she could be, but she had to try. Something in Ethan's eyes softened, just slightly. "Apology accepted, Miss Harrington." She hesitated. "Isabelle," she corrected gently. "And that's not all I wanted to say." She reached for the folder on the table, her fingers tracing its edges. "I did some research this morning." Ethan's expression shifted, his voice carefully measured. "I see." Isabelle took a deep breath, forcing herself to push past the nerves tightening in her throat. "My mother was a classical pianist," she admitted, the words tumbling out now that she had started. "She faced similar obstacles in her career. It's why she gave up performing, to teach instead." She paused, fighting the sting of tears threatening to surface. "The song you sang last night, it was her favorite." Ethan's guarded expression flickered. Recognition. Understanding. "She used to play it every Sunday morning," Isabelle continued. Then her voice dropped lower. "She died 10 years ago. Cancer." Her fingers tightened around the folder. "I stopped listening to music after that," she confessed. "I couldn't bear it. But last night when you sang..." She trailed off, unable to find the words. Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "My grandmother taught me that song," he said softly. "She worked extra shifts to pay for my voice lessons. Believed in me more than I believed in myself sometimes." He swallowed. "She passed last year. I still have medical bills from her final months." Isabelle nodded. Something unspoken flowed between them, a quiet recognition of the weight they both carried. A shared grief, a shared loss, a shared love for the music that had shaped them both. After a moment, Isabelle glanced down at the folder again. "I read about what happened at the Metropolitan Opera," she said gently. Ethan's jaw tightened. She saw it immediately, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. "It wasn't right," she said. Ethan exhaled through his nose. "A lot of things aren't right, Isabelle." She leaned forward, urgency creeping into her voice. But should we just accept that? Ethan hesitated. My mother always said music was a universal language, that it could bridge any divide. She swallowed. Last night when you sang, I felt her presence for the first time in years. Ethan's gaze softened again. Then he nodded. Music has power, he agreed, but after a moment his voice turned somber. But so do other things. Money, prejudice, fear. I know, Isabelle whispered. She lowered her gaze. I've been part of that problem. Last night made me see that very clearly. She took a deep breath. Then cautiously she continued. I have connections in the music world. My mother's old contacts. I could. No, Ethan's response was sharp, cutting through her offer before she could finish. His voice was firm, unwavering. I appreciate the thought, but I'm not interested in charity. Isabelle shook her head. It wouldn't be charity. It would be rectifying a wrong, she insisted. Ethan exhaled. Then, standing, he adjusted his tie. My talent is my own, Isabelle, he said, his tone gentle but resolute. What I choose to do with it is also my own choice. Isabelle looked up at him, desperation flickering in her expression. But he had already turned to leave. I appreciate your apology, Isabelle. He nodded once, but I need to get back to work. As Ethan moved toward the kitchen, Isabelle's voice called after him. Would you? He paused. She swallowed, forcing herself to steady her voice. Would you tell me about her? Your grandmother? Ethan turned, surprise flickering across his features. Something about the way she asked, a mixture of genuine remorse and quiet hope, made him pause. He glanced at his watch. Then, finally, he sighed and sat back down. I have 10 minutes before my shift officially starts, he said. She was an extraordinary woman. For the next 10 minutes, they shared stories of the women who had shaped their lives. Isabelle spoke of Sunday mornings at the piano, of her mother's unwavering dedication to teaching underprivileged students. Ethan spoke of his grandmother's determination, of her faith in his talent, of her belief that music could open doors that prejudice had slammed shut. When he finally stood to begin his shift, something between them had shifted as well. The waiter and the wealthy patron were gone. Instead, there were just two people who had, against all odds, glimpsed something real in each other. Isabelle hesitated as he turned to leave. Then, tentatively, same time tomorrow? She cleared her throat. I'd like to hear more about your time at Berkeley. Ethan studied her for a moment. Then slowly, he nodded. Same time tomorrow. As he walked away, Isabelle remained at the table, staring down at the Carnegie Hall program. For the first time in 10 years, she reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over a contact she hadn't dialed in a decade. Then finally, she pressed call. When the other end picked up, she heard the unmistakable voice of her father, his tone laced with surprise. Dad, she said softly. A pause. Then, tell me more about Mom's teaching program, the one for underprivileged music students. Outside, the autumn sun cast golden light across the streets of Manhattan. Inside the restaurant, Ethan moved between tables with his usual grace, but something in his step felt lighter than before. Sometimes he realized, transformation didn't come in grand gestures. It came in small moments of understanding. His gaze drifted toward the baby grand piano in the corner of the restaurant, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder about possibilities. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. Baby, when the right door opens, you'll know it. Just make sure your heart is ready to walk through it. Isabelle leaned forward, studying the yellowed newspaper clipping. The photo showed a teenage Ethan Caldwell, standing on stage, a trophy clutched in his hands. His smile was unguarded, his eyes full of hope and confidence. She glanced up. Tell me about Berkeley, she said softly. Ethan's fingers traced the edge of an old photograph, one of him standing in front of the famous conservatory. He exhaled. It was everything I dreamed of and everything I feared. He hesitated, gathering his thoughts. I was one of only 3 black students in the vocal program that year. The pressure to prove yourself, to be twice as good just to be seen as equal, it never lets up. Isabelle nodded, silent but listening. But you succeeded, she pointed out, gesturing to a glowing review from his graduate recital. Ethan let out a soft, almost bitter chuckle. I did. His voice held both pride and pain. Full scholarship, top of my class, multiple competition wins. Everything was falling into place. Then his expression shifted, his gaze turning distant. And then came the Metropolitan Opera opportunity. Isabelle sat very still. She had read the vague news articles, but she knew there was more beneath the surface. Ethan's voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it. They needed a replacement tenor for Don Giovanni. He exhaled slowly. The artistic director had heard me perform at a showcase. He said I was perfect for the role. A bitter smile crossed his face. What he didn't say was that some of the board members and major donors had concerns. Isabelle stiffened. She already knew the answer, but she asked anyway. Concerns about your race? Ethan nodded. They never said it outright, of course. It was always wrapped in polite phrases. He mimicked their carefully chosen words. Audience expectations, traditional casting, box office considerations. Then his voice dropped to a quiet, resigned tone. But the message was clear. He turned the page in the photo album, revealing a series of photographs from various opera productions during his student years. I'd faced it before. He hesitated. But this was different. This was supposed to be my big break. His fingers curled slightly over the page. Instead, I learned that talent isn't always enough. His voice was quiet. Some doors stay closed, no matter how well you sing. Ethan closed the album gently, as if it held something fragile. The artistic director was apologetic, said his hands were tied, offered to help me find other opportunities. Isabelle felt anger rise in her chest. She clenched her jaw. But you didn't look for other opportunities? Ethan let out a humorless laugh. I tried. His expression darkened. But after the Met, word gets around. His voice turned bitter. Suddenly, other companies that had been interested weren't returning calls. Audition slots were mysteriously filled. Competition entries, lost in the mail. He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. My grandmother was sick by then. The medical bills were piling up. A long pause. Then softly, so I made a choice. Isabelle swallowed, already knowing what was coming. I took this job, focused on taking care of her. His voice lowered. She never forgave herself, you know, kept saying that if she hadn't gotten sick, I could have kept trying. Isabelle's throat tightened. But it wasn't her fault, she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. No, it wasn't. A faint, sad smile. But she sacrificed so much for my dream. Watching it slip away broke her heart just as much as it broke mine. Isabelle hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached across the table. Her hand hovered for a second before gently resting over his. Ethan didn't pull away. After a long moment, she asked, "And you haven't sung professionally since?" Ethan let out a slow breath. Last week was the first time I sang in public since my grandmother's funeral. He glanced away, his voice quiet. She made me promise to sing Amazing Grace for her, said it was our song. The weight of the revelation settled between them. Finally, Isabelle spoke. My mother faced similar barriers, she said. Ethan's eyes lifted to hers, not because of race, but because she refused to play the game. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a photo. She turned the screen toward him. A picture of Elizabeth Harrington, seated at a grand piano, surrounded by children of all ages and backgrounds. This was her program, Isabelle explained. She took her concert earnings and poured them into music education for underserved communities. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The board members at the symphony hated it, said she was devaluing classical music by making it too accessible. Ethan studied the photo, taking in the joy on the children's faces. What happened to the program, he asked. Isabelle looked away, then quietly, after she died, I let it fade away. A bitter chuckle. I was angry, hurt. I threw myself into real estate, into money, into proving something to people who never really mattered. She shook her head. I became exactly the kind of person my mother spent her life fighting against. A pause. Then Ethan's voice, soft but certain. Until last week. She let out a quiet breath. Until last week. When you sang? It was like hearing her voice again. Her voice shook slightly. Like remembering who I used to be. Who I was supposed to be. The restaurant was beginning to fill with early dinner guests. Ethan glanced at his watch, knowing he needed to start his shift soon. Thank you, Isabelle said suddenly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. For what? She swallowed. For sharing this with me. For helping me remember. Ethan carefully closed the photo album, tucking it back into his bag. Sometimes, we need reminding of who we are, he said. A small, knowing smile. Your mother understood that, so did my grandmother. As he stood to leave, Isabelle hesitated. Then, Ethan, he turned back. She exhaled slowly. Would you be willing to see something tomorrow, before your shift? He tilted his head, intrigued. What is it? Her fingers curled against her lap as if bracing herself. My mother's old studio. She met his gaze. It's been closed since she died, but I think it's time to open those doors again. The building looked smaller than Isabelle remembered. 10 years of neglect had settled into its walls, leaving behind dust and stillness. But the bones were still good. She fumbled with the keys, the metal cold against her fingertips as Ethan stood beside her, both of them squinting against the morning sun. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of stale air thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten melodies. Isabelle stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Sheet music lay scattered across a desk, frozen in time, like the remnants of a lesson never finished. She ran a finger along the dust-covered surface of a baby grand piano, her voice quiet. Mom always said a music studio should look lived in. She brushed the dust from the keys, her mother's words echoing in her mind. Too much tidiness stifles creativity. Ethan moved through the space slowly, his eyes scanning the rows of chairs, the photographs on the walls, the bookshelves lined with music theory texts and lesson plans. He stopped in front of a framed photo of a woman surrounded by smiling students. He gestured to it. Your mother taught here? Isabelle nodded. Her throat tightened. This was her sanctuary, she said. She glanced around the studio, her voice thick with emotion. She called it Harmony House, a place where any child with a love of music could learn, regardless of what they could pay. Ethan took a slow breath, looking around again. The air felt heavy, not just with dust but with the weight of something unfinished. The day she was diagnosed, Isabelle continued, voice barely above a whisper, she was planning a student showcase. Ethan lifted the piano lid, pressing a single key. A single, clear note rang out, surprisingly in tune, despite years of disuse. Isabelle exhaled sharply, as if the sound had stirred something deep inside her. You kept it maintained, Ethan observed. She hesitated. Then, with a small nod, the tuner still comes twice a year. She let out a small, almost embarrassed laugh. I never canceled the service. I just couldn't bring myself to. She crossed the room and opened a filing cabinet. Inside, stacks of manila folders held student records, lesson plans, sheet music, an entire history of lives touched by her mother's passion. Ethan carefully picked up a framed newspaper article from the wall. The headline read, Local Studio Brings Classical Music to All Mall. Below it, a quote from Elizabeth Harrington stood out. Music isn't a privilege for the wealthy. It's a birthright for everyone. Ethan studied the words for a long moment before setting the frame back in its place. Then he turned to Isabelle. What are you planning? Isabelle squared her shoulders, the nostalgia in her expression replaced by determination. I want to reopen the studio. She swallowed. To continue my mother's work. She looked him straight in the eye. But I need help. Ethan blinked, surprised. She took a breath, steadying herself. I need someone who understands both the music and the barriers some of these kids will face. Her voice softened, but her conviction didn't waver. Someone who can teach, inspire, lead. She could see the doubt in Ethan's expression before he even spoke, so she pressed on before he could refuse. This isn't charity. It's not even about you, really. She gestured to the stacks of folders, the photographs, the ghosts of past students who had walked these halls. It's about them. The talented kids out there facing the same obstacles you did. The ones who need someone to believe in them. She moved to the piano, lifting a photograph of her mother teaching a young student. Her fingers traced the edges of the frame. Mom used to say that sometimes our greatest disappointments lead us to our true purpose. She looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes again. Maybe this is where your voice was meant to be all along. Ethan was silent for a long moment. He looked around the studio again, and for the first time he could almost see it as it must have been. The sound of laughter from young students, the rich harmonies of a choir warming up, the gentle coaching of a teacher correcting a note, the kind of space he wished he had as a child. He exhaled. I have a job, Isabelle. Bills to pay. She didn't hesitate. The studio has an endowment. My mother made sure of that. Her voice softened. It's been sitting untouched all these years. The salary would be more than what you make at the restaurant. She took a small step closer. And you'd have full creative control of the program. Ethan looked down at the piano, running his fingers over its smooth surface. Why me? Isabelle smiled slightly. Because you understand what it means to have a gift and face obstacles. She paused. Because you never let those obstacles destroy your spirit. Her gaze softened. And because when you sang Amazing Grace that night, you reminded me of everything my mother believed in. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the space in golden light. Ethan hesitated, then sat at the piano. His fingers found the keys instinctively, as if they had been waiting for this moment. A soft melody filled the air. Isabelle's breath caught in her throat. She recognized it instantly. "Claire de Lune," she whispered. Ethan didn't respond. He simply continued playing. The notes grew stronger, more confident, filling the empty space with something long absent. As the final note faded, Ethan sat quietly for a moment. His hands rested on the keys. Isabelle hardly dared to breathe. Then finally, he spoke. "I'll think about it." Isabelle nodded. That was all she could ask for now. She reached into her bag and pulled out the studio keys. She set them on the piano. "Take your time," she said. "The studio has waited 10 years. It can wait a little longer for the right person." As they locked the door behind them, neither spoke. But something had shifted. Like the first notes of a new composition beginning to take shape. As Isabelle pulled out her car keys, she glanced at Ethan. "Will you be at work tonight?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, someone has to make sure you get the properly chilled wine." She laughed softly, shaking her head. Then, as he turned to leave, she called after him. "Same time tomorrow?" Ethan paused, then gave a small nod. "Same time tomorrow." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Someone has to make sure you get the properly chilled wine." Isabelle smiled, remembering just how far they had come from that first cruel encounter. Sometimes, she reflected, second chances came in unexpected forms. As she drove him back to his apartment, her mind was already racing with possibilities. The studio could be cleaned, painted, renewed. Her mother's program could live again, touching new lives, opening new doors. But first, she knew Ethan needed to find his own way forward. Some songs couldn't be rushed. They needed time to find their proper rhythm. The renovation of Harmony House took 6 weeks. Now Isabelle stood in the freshly painted reception area, surveying the transformation. New instruments lined the walls. The hardwood floors gleamed, polished and restored. Afternoon sunlight streamed through spotless windows, warming the space that had once felt so hollow. And yet, Ethan still hadn't given her an answer. She'd seen him at the studio often, usually in the quiet hours before his shifts at Levinson's, the restaurant where he still worked. Sometimes she would arrive to find him at the piano, his fingers drifting through classical pieces she remembered from childhood. Other times, she would discover carefully written out lesson plans on the teacher's desk, plans he insisted were just ideas. But tonight was different. Tonight was the studio's grand reopening gala, and Isabelle had arranged something special. Without telling Ethan. "Everything's ready," her father said, appearing beside her. Their reconciliation over the past few weeks had been tentative but genuine, built on shared memories of Elizabeth and a mutual hope for the studio's future. Isabelle nodded, smoothing down her simple black dress. No designer labels tonight. This wasn't about showing off wealth. This was about music, about legacy, about redemption. The studio filled quickly, a lively, eclectic mix of guests. Former students of Elizabeth Harrington, local music teachers, arts patrons, even some of Isabelle's real estate colleagues who had been surprised by her sudden change in priorities. Chef Benoit had catered the event, and several of the Levinson staff had come to show their support. Then finally, Ethan arrived. He wore a well-fitted charcoal suit, looking far removed from the waiter's uniform he had worn for years. And yet, pinned to his lapel, his restaurant name tag still gleamed. Isabelle suppressed a smile, still 1 foot in each world. Not quite ready to step through the door. He took in the scene around him and turned to her. "What's all this?" Before she could answer, a distinguished-looking man approached them. "Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan turned. "I'm Daniel Roberts, director of the Manhattan Conservatory's Community Outreach Program." Ethan shot Isabelle a questioning glance, but she merely smiled and stepped away, letting them talk. Throughout the evening, Isabelle had arranged for Ethan to accidentally meet key figures in New York's music education community. People who could help make Harmony House a force for change. But the crucial moment came when Isabelle's father took the small stage they had set up in the main teaching room. He cleared his throat. "Good evening, everyone." The room quieted. 10 years ago, my late wife, Elizabeth, had a dream that music could break down barriers and change lives. He paused, his voice filled with emotion. "Tonight, thanks to my daughter, that dream is being reborn." A murmur of warm applause rippled through the crowd. Isabelle stepped forward. She glanced at Ethan, then back at the audience. "My mother believed that talent doesn't discriminate." Her voice grew stronger. "And neither should we." She took a steady breath. Harmony House will continue her mission, providing music education to any student with the desire to learn, regardless of their background or ability to pay. A longer round of applause followed. But Isabelle wasn't finished. She turned toward Ethan. "But every dream needs a guiding voice." She felt her heart pounding, but she pressed on. "Someone who understands both the power of music and the obstacles many students face." She swallowed, her hands tightening around the microphone. "Someone who never lost their love of teaching, even when the world tried to silence their own song." Ethan stood frozen in the audience. Realization dawned on his face. "Many of you don't know," Isabelle continued, her voice carrying through the room, "but 10 years ago, another dream was deferred." She let the silence sit for a moment. A brilliant voice was silenced. Not by choice, but by prejudice, by closed doors. Her voice grew stronger. "Tonight, that changes." A deep breath. Then she turned fully to Ethan. "Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to hear the voice I believe was meant to lead Harmony House into its next chapter." A spotlight found him in the crowd. The room held its breath. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. Isabelle held hers, wondering if she had overstepped. Then, slowly, he made his way to the stage. Ethan stood before the microphone. He surveyed the room. Isabelle could see him wrestling with the moment, with everything it represented. Then, finally, he spoke. 10 years ago, I lost my voice." He let the words settle in the room, not physically, but in every way that mattered. His voice grew thick with emotion. "I let disappointment and discrimination convince me that silence was safer than song." A deep breath. "But my grandmother used to say." He glanced toward Isabelle, then back at the audience. "God doesn't give us gifts to hide them. He gives them to share, to teach, to heal." The room remained silent, hanging on his every word. Ethan turned to Isabelle. "A few weeks ago, a cruel moment became an unexpected blessing." His voice softened. "It reminded me that music isn't just about performance." He looked out at the audience. "It's about connection, about transformation, about grace." Then, without another word, he moved to the piano. The room stayed hushed as he sat down. And then, he began to play. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. Then with natural elegance he began to play. The opening notes of Moonlight Sonata filled the room. But then, he did something unexpected. He began to sing. A rich, deep baritone, wordless yet woven seamlessly into the melody, transforming the familiar piece into something entirely new. A song of loss, of hope, of rebirth. The audience stood transfixed, the weight of the moment settling over them like a hush before a storm. Isabelle felt tears slipping down her cheeks, but she was smiling. Because in Ethan's voice, she could hear her mother's dream living again. The final notes lingered in the air for a moment. Then, thunderous applause. It erupted through the studio, rolling over Ethan like a wave, voices rising in excitement. Some stood, others wiped silent tears from their faces. Ethan stood, bowing slightly, his eyes finding Isabelle's in the crowd. And in that look was his answer, not just to the job offer, but to the challenge of believing in dreams again. Harmony House hummed with life. The sound of scales, arpeggios, and laughter drifted from the practice rooms. Photographs of new students joined the old ones on the walls, creating a timeline of the studio's legacy. Ethan sat at his desk, Elizabeth Harrington's old desk, reviewing applications for the studio's scholarship program. The pile had grown substantially since word had spread about Harmony House's mission and success. Then, a timid voice. "Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan looked up. Jasmine, a 12-year-old violinist, stood in the doorway, clutching her case. "I was wondering, could I practice here during lunch? The other kids make fun of me when I practice at school." Ethan smiled, remembering his own school days. "Come in, Jasmine." He led her to a framed photograph hanging on the wall. His grandmother, dressed in her church choir robe, smiling like she always had when he sang. "This is the woman who taught me that other people's judgment doesn't define your talent." He gestured to the practice room. "How about we work on your piece together?" Jasmine's eyes brightened. "Really? Really?" As they played, Isabelle arrived for her weekly visit. She paused in the doorway, watching Ethan guide Jasmine through a difficult passage. His patience, his ability to build confidence while maintaining high standards. These were gifts just as valuable as his voice. The studio had exceeded expectations. Students from all backgrounds filled the classes. Some paid full tuition, others were on scholarships, but all were held to the same standard of dedication. Ethan had assembled a diverse faculty, creating an environment where every student could see themselves represented in their teachers. Later, after Jasmine left for her next class, Isabelle and Ethan sat in his office, drinking coffee. From Levinson's, of course. Chef Benoit insisted on keeping them supplied. "The board approved the expansion," Isabelle announced. She set her coffee down, eyes sparkling. "We can start looking at properties for the second location whenever you're ready." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. The studio's success had drawn attention from arts organizations across the city. Rather than compete, they had chosen to collaborate, creating a network of opportunities for talented students who might otherwise be overlooked. "Your mother would be proud," Ethan said softly. "Not just of the studio, but of you." Isabelle touched the locket she always wore now. Inside, a photo of Elizabeth, at the piano. "She would be proud of both of us," Isabelle murmured. "We're continuing her fight, just in a different way." Their conversation was interrupted by sounds from the main room, students arriving for the afternoon chamber music program. Among them, Trevor Langston's son, the same Trevor who had been at that fateful birthday dinner a year ago. His initial skepticism about sending his child to Harmony House had transformed into enthusiastic support after seeing his son's talent flourish under Ethan's guidance. Isabelle watched as Trevor greeted Ethan with a handshake. She turned to him. "We're changing minds," she observed. "One student, one parent, at a time." Ethan stood, straightening his tie, no longer a waiter's uniform, but the mark of a respected teacher. "That's how real change happens," he said, "not through grand gestures, but through daily choices, to see each other's humanity." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the gold lettering on the wall. Harmony House, where music knows no barriers. Below it, two framed photographs hung side by side, Elizabeth Harrington and Ethan's grandmother, the women whose dreams had shaped this place. The halls were filled with students now, creating the joyful chaos Elizabeth had always loved. Isabelle watched as Ethan moved among them, greeting each one by name, offering encouragement, correcting a note, adjusting a posture. His voice, once silenced, now filled the studio with purpose and hope. That evening, as they locked up the studio, a sound made them pause. From one of the practice rooms, a clear, young voice singing Amazing Grace, Jasmine, working on the piece for the upcoming student showcase. Ethan and Isabelle exchanged a look. They didn't need words. The song that had brought them here, the song that had sparked this transformation, it lived on, in a new generation. As they walked out into the evening, the studio's lights dimming behind them, the last notes of Jasmine's voice followed them. Amazing Grace, indeed. The journey from a cruel moment in a restaurant to the rebirth of Harmony House had been unexpected, painful, and beautiful. Ethan and Isabelle's story reminds us that true transformation isn't instant. It happens in the choices we make, the voices we lift, the barriers we break. And that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, because sometimes the right door opens, and we just have to be ready to walk through it. Ethan moved through the studio, offering encouragement here, a gentle correction there. His voice, once silenced by prejudice, now filled Harmony House with purpose and hope. "Time for the advanced vocal class," he said, checking his watch. He turned to Isabelle. "Want to stay and listen?" She smiled, settling into a chair near the piano. As Ethan began the lesson, his rich baritone guided young voices through their exercises. Isabelle closed her eyes for a moment. She could feel her mother's presence so strongly in the room. The studio had come full circle, healing old wounds, creating new possibilities. Later that evening, as they locked up, a sound made them pause. From one of the practice rooms, a clear voice, singing Amazing Grace, Jasmine, practicing for the upcoming student showcase. Ethan and Isabelle exchanged a knowing look. The song that had brought them together, the song that had sparked this transformation, lived on. In a new generation, the cruel game at a restaurant had become a catalyst for something greater, proving that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes. "See you tomorrow?" Isabelle asked, already knowing the answer. Ethan nodded, his keys jingling as he pocketed them. "Tomorrow." Then with a small smile, "And all the tomorrows after that. There's work to be done." As they walked out into the evening, the studio's lights dimming behind them, the last notes of Jasmine's song followed them. Amazing Grace indeed. Harmony House reminds us that beneath our social masks and predetermined roles, we all carry stories of loss, hope, and potential. Ethan and Isabelle's journey, from antagonists to allies, shows us how confronting our own prejudices can lead to powerful transformation. Their story challenges us to ask, how many voices remain unheard because of barriers we create? How many dreams are deferred because we fail to see the humanity in others? Like Isabelle, we may need to confront our privilege and biases. Like Ethan, we may need the courage to reclaim the gifts we've hidden. And like both of them, we must recognize, true change happens one moment at a time. One interaction, one decision, one act of grace. Don't let its message end here. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Support music education programs in underserved communities. Use your voice to amplify those who have been silenced. Most importantly, remember, transformation often begins in unexpected moments, even in something as simple as a song. Like this video, your engagement helps spread this important message. Subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of our shared humanity. Together, we can work toward a world where talent knows no barriers. Grace transforms cruelty. Every voice has the chance to be heard.